Today's guest is Ilyse Hogue, an American activist with a long history on the progressive left. Ilyse is perhaps best known as president of NARAL Pro Choice America, now Reproductive Freedom for All, a position she held from 2013 to 2021. There, she emphasized integrating the reproductive rights struggle into the larger progressive movement, linking feminism to other related projects, the environment, our changing media, and the health of the Democratic Party itself. During a stint at New America, Ilyse was part of a team with former Congressman Colin Allred and pollster John Della Volpe that incubated a new project to persuade young men that the Democratic Party cares about what they care about: prosperity, economic justice, and the resources everyone needs to build a future. Speaking with American Men is a $20 million initiative to re engage men between the ages of 18 and 29 in the project of rebuilding our democracy. Why? Because Democrats narrowly lost this demographic to Donald Trump in 2024 after winning it by 12 points in 2020. Like many feminists, Ilyse isn't the kind of person who walks away from a fight like that. And friends, she's got a plan. Let's listen to what she had to say. Ilyse Hogue, welcome to Political Junkie.
Hi, Claire. It's so great to be here.
Well, I'm excited about this because I was reading Sam, the Speaking with American Men document, and you're one of the co authors. And I wonder if we could just start by you telling our listeners, where did the concept for Sam emerge? And who backed the initial phases and who is moving it forward now?
Sure. So, um, honestly, what we certainly weren't calling it Sam at the time, but the sort of challenge that we were trying to address came to my attention while I was leading NARAL Pro Choice America, which is now called Reproductive Freedom for All, one of the country's preeminent abortion rights organizations. And as part of my tenure there, I was there for the better part of a decade. We decided we really had to understand the information ecosystem. We were kind of in an information war, and who was driving anti-abortion narratives and mobilizing adherents on the other side. So we set up an opposition research operation. It was the most robust in the sector. And sort of a little bit by accident, honestly, Claire, we started to see all of this activity of young men who were not presenting the way traditional anti-choice people were. We're not even overtly anti-choice, but we're animated by a lot of their information ecosystems that were just kind of swimming in misogynistic content. They emerged as a huge force. They came out of online spaces that organized around Gamergate. I don't know if your listeners know Gamergate, but it was an online bullying of female game designers who were creating games with female protagonists. And this loosely organized group emerged as a huge force for Trump in his first run. Arguably did a tremendous amount of work to help him emerge out of the initial primary in 2016, and then continued to back him through his first presidency. Like I said, I kept monitoring these online spaces, trying to understand what young men were being fed as they were driven more and more online, but I wasn't really in a position to do anything about it while I was at NARAL. So after I left NARAL, I spent a couple of years at New America, which is a fantastic DC organization that supports research, running what we called our Gender Extremism and Engagement Program. And that was really time looking at what is happening online with these young men who are going on to look for things like fitness or gaming strategy or things like that, and what's getting served up to them in their online algorithms. And what we learned was pretty startling, that the right had put an enormous amount of resources and energy into establishing a presence in these online spaces, cracking the algorithms so that if you are on TikTok or you are, in Twitch, it's not that far a journey for you to go on saying, I want to learn how to bench press better. And then pretty soon you're getting an Andrew Tate video that's telling you
Mhm.
you can't have nice things because women are advancing too far in the world. But the other thing that happened through this research that was really interesting was an understanding that sort of temperamentally, a lot of these young men are actually what we would probably call, not what we would call progressive, but held progressive priorities. They
Mhm.
want affordable housing, they want universal health care. And we were kind of ceding the entire space to the right to formulate first their sort of identity and then their politics. And so a handful of us were writing papers and articles and sort of screaming into the void in the lead up to 2024 saying, Houston, we have a problem. There's an entire online ecosystem you all aren't even aware of that is pursuing grievance politics on on behalf of Trump. And we can't win if we don't play. We don't have anyone in these spaces. We're not resourcing leaders. And that sort of, like I said, fell into a vacuum. But after the election, the results were too stark to ignore. We lost men of every race, class, and ethnicity. And by lost, I don't mean absolute numbers, but I mean there was rightward slide in those
11 points, wasn't
demographics.
it? 11
Well,
points.
yeah, I
I
mean,
mean,
yes, 28 points for
that's a
Latino
lot.
men. It depends on how
Yeah.
you slice and dice the data, but it's double
Right.
digits no matter how you look at it.
Yeah.
And um, we started to say, I came together with a couple of other folks who were saying, unless we're willing to invest in engagement, actually be in the spaces where these young men are getting their information, equipping folks to fight the fights, then we're losing this generation, not just for the next election, but for the next 50 years of their voting lives. And not only does that mean Democrats can't win, but it means democracy honestly cannot survive.
Yeah. So I'm looking at a couple things. One is for about 20 years, feminist sociologists have been talking about how lonely boys are, how difficult it is for them to make and keep friends. A friend of mine named CJ Pascoe wrote a book called Dude, You're a Fag, in which she talked about homophobia as sort of like the way men express their frustration with each other and fend off the idea that to be a friend means to be gay in some way. We've also got a fair amount of literature that shows how much the right has invested in campus activism. Okay, so liberals give students unpaid internships to do DEI in the dorm, and conservatives actually pay people to go around campus turning in their professors and writing blogs and stuff like that. So we know a lot about what the right has invested in youth. What in particular makes boys and young men so vulnerable to the right wing siren call?
Yeah, I mean, look, Sam has a mantra, which is we can't win if we don't play. So part of what makes them vulnerable is, as you say, a lack of dedicated resources to listening to them, vying for their attention, and offering an alternative vision of how they can be included in a pluralistic coalition that fights for progress for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot more technical elements to it than that, to your point. Turning Point USA, Charlie Kirk got, that he runs an $80 million a year campus organization. And he really made a big bet that he openly says his sort of benefactors laughed at, which was that he could move young men, typically sort of Democratic constituency, 10 points in 10 years. Well, he beat that. He beat it by
Mm-hmm.
4 years and he moved them by more than 10 points. So, to some degree, that is the total absence of alternative voices in the spaces where they are. Loneliness is something that definitely comes up. I think everyone is lonely. I don't totally think that that's restricted to young men, but there's no question that young men who encountered sort of the double whammy of online culture breakdown in civic institutions and then the pandemic, which pushed them even more online, don't really, they tell us, we did 60 hours of listening. They tell us they don't really know how to form sort of community relationships, and we're not helping them do that. But there's another thing that came out that I think is possibly even more potent when we look at the collective impact of what's happening with young men, which is there was a broad expression of shame.
Mhm.
Shame that is coupled with economic and social anxiety. That means they don't know how to get ahead. They don't know how to provide, which is what all of culture and all of their role models told them is a core masculine trait. They don't know how to protect. And that has created a sense of internal shame. And you may be familiar with the academic literature that shows that shame is one of the most salient emotions that is most easily translated into radicalism. And so when we think about shame as a driver, one of the things that we are working on are messages that, like, the shame is not theirs to own. The shame is actually a product of a manipulation of social and market forces that are designed to exclude them. And that if they can and are willing to participate in work to actually diminish the power of those forces, and that's concentration of wealth and power and all the things you know about and I know about, that there is a different pathway forward for them.
Yeah. So one of the things, and I want to be clear with our audience, you are not associated with the Democratic Party. This is a standalone project that was incubated, perhaps at New America, but it's a standalone project. That's $20 million is budgeted for it. Are there policy proposals that you hope will come out of this project? Because one of the things I think about, Ilyse, is, and not that I want the draft to come back, but actually the draft was one thing that most young men had in common. And then there was a certain point at which it was either the anti-war movement or the draft. But there was organizing, either state-sponsored or grassroots, that pulled young men into alliances with each other. IRAP, the Great Society program, in which white kids went into black and brown neighborhoods to organize and so on. Are there policy proposals that go beyond living in these virtual communities and seek to pull young men into physical and social community with each other?
I mean, so there are, but Sam is not a policy shop. And
Right.
I really want to be clear about that. We work with great
Thank you.
people who do that hard work. Richard Reeves is among the best known, Gary Barker at Equimundo, Ross Riquetto Morales at the Men's Project. The role that I think we play is saying, we've mapped these information ecosystems. We
Right.
see leaders within them who, to your previous point, are not resourced, are not actually networked together to make a bigger effect, and how young men are interpreting what is happening in the world around them,
Right.
far upstream from politics than politics as well. Our listening inevitably allows us to communicate to our partners in the field and to any candidate willing to listen. Honestly, that tends, our audience tends to be more Democratic leading, about how these guys are seeing their interests. I sort of intentionally differentiate interests from policies, because the idea that most Americans are sitting there reading and looking at policies and understanding the nuances is sort of fundamentally flawed. But like I said, their interests are something that we feel like we can effectively reflect to people who are writing policy and running campaigns. And then the question of when policies are moving and when it's in the news, how we actually can make sure that they're getting the progressive perspective on that in the Discord servers that they're in the subreddits, and in the Twitch streams is crucially important, because right now you could have the best policy in the world moving, but they're interpreters of what that policy is, what it means, and who benefits from it is entirely mediated by right-wing forces. So, I think there would be a tremendous amount of openness to an idea of national service. I think, really we're talking about what's popping being much more sort of survival based. How do I get a better paying job? How do I afford, stable housing, those kinds of things. But what we've learned from being in these spaces is they want more information about how to make their lives better. They're getting it from one side and not from the other.
That's very interesting. And one of the things I've noticed, just to sort of put a wrap on this piece of the conversation, is my generation, there was the Peace Corps. And I knew a lot of people in my senior class at college who went and did the Peace Corps, and they came back with very strong ideas, not only about what they wanted to do, but how they were going to get there. But we're also talking about a time in which getting into and paying for college itself is really sort of under question. It's very difficult for people to do. It appears that young men sort of take a look at the whole thing and go, "Oh no, I can't deal with this." Whereas young women will sort of pull themselves together and figure it out. Why is there such a difference between young women feeling a sense of purpose and young men feeling a sense of purpose?
Well, that is a very big question that I can take a stab at from my point of view, but I'm not sure I can fulsomely answer. I mean, I think we have rightly and reasonably, and both you and I have participated in this, in resourcing, not perfectly, but moving a both social and political agenda that young women see their interests actually reflected in, right? And there's a lot of both rhetoric, but actual policies and ambassadors to those policies saying, hey, look what's in this for you. If you work with us, if you put the time in, you're going to reap the benefits of it. So they're bought into a component of a social contract, particularly that is sort of coded democratic, that young men are not, right? Because we haven't put in the commensurate interest with them. We sort of sweep them in by, we tend to lead with race or ethnicity, right? Like Democrats have a program for Black men, and they assume that means that young men see themselves as Black before men. And some of those assumptions are what we're trying to challenge. And in fact, I might go on a tangent, and you are free to edit it if you want. But one of the things that we learned in our research is that under 30, Generation Z has really bought into that they are the most multiracial generation. They're mostly totally fine with that. And so misogyny has become the gateway drug for the right to pull them in, much more than white supremacy, which we saw was more effective in the older generations. And the Proud Boys always say they're one of the most diverse groups in America, and they're not wrong, right? And so there's a piece of this that we need to think about in terms of how people are self-identifying, the multiple identities that, the left would call it intersectionality. That is not language that these young men are using, but it happens to be true. And so they, there are people who do this well. Governor Wes Moore, Governor Gretchen Whitmer, Cory Booker, they have started to say, oh, if we want you to see yourself as part of this coalition, we're going to call you out explicitly, and sometimes we're going to have policy that is for you. I will say that what we've experienced, I mean, the sort of reporting on and pushback to the project has been really informative. But one of the things that I feel viscerally coming from critics on the Democratic and left side is that we have really cemented ourselves in this zero-sum game way of doing politics. And in fact, that to me is very anti-progressive and anti-democratic, right? It means like we should and can have a vision that is not about moving pieces on a board where one person gets ahead and then the other person has to take a step back. In fact, the sort of winning vision is going to be the one that can really inhabit pluralism as people have more and more intersecting identities.
Hmm. So let's talk about masculinity for a little bit, because there's a lot of stuff out there about what's wrong with men and what's wrong with young men, and a lot of perseverating about that. And the right picks up on that and says, yes, all these things are wrong with you, but it's not your fault. It's the fault of women. It's the fault of Black people and immigrants taking your jobs and so on. How might one turn that around in an online space and say, hey guys, here's what's right about you, and this is how to activate it?
Yeah, I'm going to answer that in uh, a way that may be frustrating, but
Okay.
the way that I see doing that is lifting up the young men who are doing that all the time.
Uh-huh.
And that I have been in these spaces long enough to say, oh my God, that guy, Luke, I
Hmm.
sometimes only know them by their handles because they're online, is
Hmm.
really trying to fight out a different vision of masculinity, but he's being drowned by the surround sound of the right. So, how do we find the 100 Lukes, network them together so they're not doing hand to hand combat one by one, but they become much more of an organized force? It's basic organizing, quite honestly, and then resource them with what they need to do better fighting for this vision. I think there are both positive visions of masculinity out there. There are also people who are pointing out that the negative vision doesn't work,
Great.
right? And that, like, every time that we see a clip of Trump bullying someone, that there needs to be a service that is clipping that, putting it into all these spaces, giving it to these young men who are organizing and saying, hey, I don't know that we know what a new version of masculinity totally looks like, but it doesn't look like that. I was
Hmm.
raised by my father, my grandfather, my coaches to say that bullying is not what a man does. And I think we're not doing any of the above right now.
I think that's really important. I am sort of a sideways fan of Taylor Lawrence. I read her newsletter all the time. And one of the things she's been talking about a lot lately, which sort of intersects with this project, is she says basically the left has abandoned online spaces to the right, and that the right has an infrastructure. And, if we point to what's going on in Los Angeles now, the right had influencers on the ground immediately. There were these networks of professionals that were just pumping out content. How do we go about doing that, but doing it in an ethical way where we're being upfront about who we are, being authentic, and connecting with people without, you know, bending the facts or trying to manipulate them?
I mean, I think the good news is that we don't have to bend the facts to
Hmm.
win our arguments,
Hmm.
which they do have to do. And we saw
Hmm.
that over and over again in our town halls with young
Right.
men.
Right.
What we need to do is break the sort of monopolistic grip that the right has
Right.
on these channels, right? So it's not, I keep saying it's not rocket science. It's kind of doing what we've done in other sectors. The innovation is actually recognizing that we need to do it in this sector,
Mhm.
which is there are great leaders and great organizers and people who are producing content. If they need resources to get out in the streets of LA and show a different version of what's
Right.
going on, and then what I would call, which is a little bit what Sam is, a back office to make sure that's getting
Right.
distributed as widely as possible, that's much more than half the battle,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Because if you look at the media asymmetry, just a map of how much real estate the right owns in online space, Taylor is totally right about this, we should have lost by a lot more than we did,
Mm-hmm.
which says to me that some modest investments actually will go a long way
Right.
in regaining ground. And Sam did put out a funding proposal for $20 million. The media sort of mislabeled that we had all the money. We don't, that it was all for research. It's not. It's a 2-year engagement program. But just for an apples to apples comparison, Trump's campaign spent $20 million on engagement of young men between Labor Day and Election Day in 2024.
Right. Right.
And Sam is suggesting we spend the same amount over 2 years. And I got to say, the pushback that these young men were worth that level of investment was dispiriting, but also kind of terrifying, because the
Right.
alternative is not great.
Right. But, part of what you're making me think about, and tell me whether this is right or not, is your project has a goal. And then there need to be ancillary efforts to say to young women, this is not about boxing you out. What can a feminist do to support young men? What can a feminist do to think about policies that allow young men to achieve their dreams? Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I also think, again, we don't see much divergence on the policies,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, we had young men say to us in our listening tour, I love that my wife makes more money than me. I
Right.
just want to be able to contribute as well. I
Right.
think some of this is in our own flawed frames, which
Right.
is, I come from the feminist world. I am a proud feminist. I would never promote any kind of policy that is at the
Yeah.
expense of hard
Yeah.
fought gains. But I don't think we need to. What we do need to quell are people in our own ranks who seem to authentically believe that anyone who is not already with us in the young men set is like a hair away from a knife wielding incel. That is
Right.
the furthest thing from the truth in what we have experienced. And so, just extending a hand, recognizing that these grievances that are being, weaponized politically are actually grounded in real problems, and they're real human
Right.
problems. And that's where you start, just saying, oh my God, I see you, it's hard for me to afford rent too. What do we do together to
Right.
make that a reality?
Well, and we're also seeing, and I don't want to connect too many different things because you're the researcher and I don't know whether the research leads you there, but we're also seeing a lot of research that says that young women are frustrated in the ability to find a male partner who will really be a partner to them. And, a lot, I think it's upwards of 40% of young women are saying, I probably won't get married. And if I have a baby, it'll be by myself. That's a huge shift in the culture. And without saying whether it's a good shift or a bad shift, I don't think young women um, are finding that there are men who feel that they can support a family or support a partner or whatever. So actually doing this for men is doing this for women too. I
Well,
say
I mean,
that as a lesbian, but
yeah, you're getting to one of my favorite points. There's both this sort of capital P political point, which
yeah,
is there is a portion of young women who uh, are sort of in the feminist tank, who, with us, who are, stridently, rightfully wary of anything that would ask them to subsume their own goals and dreams
right.
to, create more space. I don't want to do that. Nobody should want to do that. There are also, just to be real, increasingly young women who are like, I want a boyfriend and I want to get married and I want to have a baby. And if they don't see that perspective reflected, then we start to lose them too. The other
Right.
thing I've been warning about is I'm starting to see, and a lot of sort of liberal and independent moms this concern manifests that Democrats don't actually care about their sons.
Mm.
And that is, so we're going to start to see that impact
Right.
sort of vote pattern and all of that. But on the larger scale, again, I live for the world where everybody gets married because they want to. Nobody gets married because they have to. It's much more about an emphasis of mutually supportive partnership. I think that that is the vision that we want to put out there. And I also think that what young men are perceiving right now is that unless they are spending overtime parroting progressive lines, then they are treated as predators, dangers, and that is not a pathway forward for anyone.
Mm-hmm. Ilyse, thank you so much. Before we go, I'm wondering if you could tell our listeners where they can see more of your writing. I know you write for a number of outlets, so where can they go to read your work?
So I write for The Bulwark, I write for Democracy Journal of Ideas, but we also have a Sam Substack, and you should check it out. It is, we just launched it a couple weeks ago, and we look for subscribers.
Fantastic. I will subscribe to it. I'm interested in what you're doing. Listeners, we're going to link to the policy document or the flyer
strategic
folder
plan, the vision
strategic plan. Yes.
And there's a research, we released our preliminary research in a report, and I'll make sure that you have that to link to as well.
Fantastic. Ilyse, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Claire. Nice to see you.
And that's it for today's show. Thanks for listening. You can subscribe to Why Now on your favorite podcast platform. Please leave a rating and a comment so that other listeners can find us. Go to the Political Junkie Substack at clairepotter.substack.com for show notes, to listen to more episodes, or leave a comment. You can subscribe for free, or you can support my work for as little as $5 a month and get every podcast and every newsletter delivered straight to your desktop. Share this podcast with a friend who loves history, politics, and smart conversation. And you can follow me on Threads, Blue Sky, or Instagram. Why Now is supported by the New School for Social Research and by paying subscribers to Political Junkie. Why Now and Political Junkie are written, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Claire Potter. My opening theme is by Galaxy News, and my closing theme is by Avocado Junkie. That's all for now. See you next time.